The wind coming off the San Francisco peaks was a living thing. By late afternoon, it had turned malevolent, a predator that dragged cold air through the dead scrub brush and howled over the frostbitten rocks that pocked Jedediah Stone's land. His cabin sat on a lonely stretch of high desert in the northern Arizona territory. It was a place of bone-dry quiet, far enough from any hint of civilization that he didn't hear a voice not his own for weeks at a time. He preferred it that way. Always had. The stillness was a comfort, a blanket he'd wrapped himself in to keep the ghosts at bay. Jedediah was 38 years old, tall and hard with the kind of strength that was forged in hauling timber, digging fence posts from frozen ground, and breaking the earth year after year. His face was a map of sun and wind, a permanent 5 o'clock shadow of a beard, trimmed short out of habit, not vanity, and his hair hung shaggy around his ears, the color of a faded wheat field. A heavy worn buffalo hide coat clung to his broad shoulders. Beneath it, his work shirt and trousers were patched and worn at the elbows and knees, the original color long since leached out by dust and time. He didn't have much anymore. A single bed, a hearth that burned with stubborn inefficiency, a rifle. He kept leaned against the corner, a chair by the window where he watched storms roll in like freight wagons on a distant rail line. He watched them with a detached interest, as if they were a distant cousin of his own inner turmoil. His past was a series of tombstones. His brother Silas had died in a Union trench near Chattanooga, a name that felt as foreign and distant as the moon. His wife Eleanor had died 2 winters later. Her lungs had filled with a fever she couldn't fight, and she had drowned in a week. The memory was a dull ache in his chest, a pain that was no longer sharp, but never fully went away. He'd buried her under the only shade tree near the barn where a lone buzzard often circled in the midday sun. He'd never put a marker on her grave. He hadn't needed to. He knew where she was. Since then, Jedediah had lived by an ironclad routine. He mended his tools, fed his livestock, hauled water, and chopped wood. He did what needed doing and nothing more. The world had already taken its shot at him. He'd figured out how to keep breathing after. That evening, as the wind turned mean and the sky faded to a bruised shade of ash, Jedediah stood by the stove. He stirred beans and salt pork in an iron pot, steam rolling into the cold air. His fingers were stiff from the day's work, even near the flame. He wasn't hungry, not truly, but he always cooked. It was another part of the routine. The food was fuel, not a pleasure. Then it came. A sound so alien to his quiet world that he almost thought he had imagined it. A knock. 3 soft raps against the door. A long pause, then 3 again. Jedediah froze, the wooden spoon suspended in his hand. The steam from the pot curled around his face, but he didn't feel the warmth. He didn't move for a long time. Not from fear, but from a profound, deep-seated caution. Nobody came this far unless they were lost or desperate or looking for something to take. He stepped to the door, his hand resting near the latch. The other hand was not far from the rifle in the corner. He didn't draw it. Not yet. The sound of the wind was louder now, as if it was telling him to be careful. He pulled the door open just enough to see, leaving the latch bolted. A woman stood there. She was young, perhaps in her mid-20s, but her eyes looked ancient, as if they had witnessed the end of the world and come back from the other side. Her dark brown hair was a tangled mess, half plastered to her face with cold sweat and dirt. Her skin was pale, ghostly in the fading light. Her lips were cracked, the corners of her mouth dry and red from the wind. Her dress had once been a simple prairie-style beige, with a faded floral pattern, but it was torn at the hem, and a jagged split ran up one thigh. The bodice was loose, and sagged, the neckline ripped, and low, revealing the smear of dirt on her cleavage, and the dark red marks on the upper swell of her chest, like the telltale imprints of fingers or a tight rope. She wasn't bleeding, but she wasn't whole either. One foot was bare, a deep cut on the arch. The other wore a mismatched moccasin, the sole half torn out. Her arms were crossed over her chest, not modestly but defensively, a shield against the world. Her whole body trembled. The cold was a part of it, to be sure, but so was a fear so profound it was almost visible. Jedediah said nothing. He stared at her, his gaze intense but not unkind. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She didn't even look at him for a long moment, staring at the floor as if eye contact was something she no longer knew how to endure. Then with great difficulty she looked up. Her voice was nearly gone, a dry rasp that barely carried over the wind. "I can cook," she whispered. Her voice trembled, a sound Jedediah was sure he would never forget. "I can clean." She swallowed hard, her throat working. "I can be quiet." That last part, "I can be quiet," wasn't a promise. It was a condition, a survival tactic she had learned through brutal experience. Jedediah looked at her a long time. He saw the tension in her shoulders, the deep bruises on her arms. He saw how her weight shifted from foot to foot, ready to bolt, even now a frightened animal trapped by the cold. She didn't say who she was or where she came from, and Jedediah didn't ask. He didn't need to. Her story was written in every line of her exhausted face, every bruise on her pale skin. He simply stepped back. That was all. He moved aside and left the door open, a silent invitation. She entered slowly, not in relief, but like someone unsure if this was a trick or a trap. The warmth of the fire hit her face, and she winced as if it hurt. She didn't look around the small cabin, her eyes fixed on some point in the distance, a faraway land of memory and pain. She walked over to the stove and stood near it, holding her arms close, her knees nearly giving out. Her breathing was a ragged, uneven sound. Jedediah shut the door and slid the heavy bolt home. The sound made her flinch, a spasm of fear she tried and failed to hide. He didn't approach her. He didn't speak. He simply turned and ladled a second helping of beans into a clean tin bowl, placed it on the table, and pulled out the other chair. He took his own seat. She didn't move. She stood by the stove, a ghost, warming her hands on a fire that didn't belong to her. Jedediah ate a few spoonfuls and watched her from the corner of his eye. Finally, she took a shaky step toward the table. Her legs moved like they weren't sure what solid ground felt like anymore. She sat down without a word, picked up the spoon, and ate small bites, slow and quiet. She didn't touch the bread until he did. Every move she made was measured, a careful calculus of a person who expected punishment if she made the wrong one. Jedediah didn't talk. Neither did she. But he noticed things. He noticed how she gripped the spoon too tight, her knuckles white. How her eyes darted to the window every time the wind blew a gust of snow against the glass. How she only chewed with her back teeth as if her jaw still hurt. After a few minutes, she finally spoke. "Clara," she said quietly, her voice a fragile thing, as if it had been a long time since anyone had used her name. Jedediah gave a short, brusque nod. Jedediah. They ate the rest of the meal in silence. When they were finished, Clara rose. She took both bowls, rinsed them with water from the barrel by the door, and wiped them dry with a clean rag she found on a hook. Jedediah didn't ask her to. She just did. It was another part of her offer. Then she found a blanket near the hearth and curled up against the wall, not far from the fire, but not on the bed. Not even on the cot folded near the back. She chose the floor. She chose a corner. She chose a space that was not Jedediah's. Her back was to the wall, her face toward the room, the blanket wrapped around her like armor. Jedediah watched her for a long moment. She was already asleep by the time he rose from the chair. He didn't speak, just moved to the back, removed his coat, and laid down on the bed without bothering to undress. As he stared at the ceiling, Jedediah's thoughts turned slow and heavy. He didn't know who had heard her. He didn't need to. He could see it in her posture, in her silence, in the way she kept herself small. But he knew one thing with an iron certainty: she had no place to go. And for now she was under his roof. That meant something. The world had a code, a law of the land that went beyond the towns and courthouses. It was a law of the heart. Morning came without color. The frost had crept up the inside of the cabin's windows, leaving pale, intricate veins across the glass like a warning of what waited outside. The hearth fire had burned low in the night, and the cold inside was sharp enough to bite through his buffalo hide coat. Jedediah sat up slowly, his back aching from another night on the too-short bed, a constant complaint he no longer bothered to heed. He didn't stretch. He just swung his legs over the edge and reached for his shirt. The cabin was still no sound from the floor. He looked toward the hearth. She was still there. Clara hadn't moved much. The blanket had slipped off one shoulder, exposing the skin beneath her torn dress. Her arms were drawn tight to her chest. Her legs curled toward her body like she'd learned not to take up space, to make herself as small as possible in a large and dangerous world. Her hair had fallen across her cheek. There was a faint line of dried dirt along the curve of her jaw, a testament to her hurried journey. Jedediah stood and stepped quietly across the floor, kneeling near the hearth. He added kindling and 2 thick logs, coaxing the flame back to life. The sound of it crackling stirred her. She flinched awake, not gently, not slowly. Her eyes opened wide like she expected a blow, and her whole body tensed. She looked at him, alert, her breath short, a gasp of air in a cabin that was supposed to be safe. Then she saw the fire. Saw him crouch beside it, not over her, not close, just working. Jedediah didn't speak. He just nodded once, a brief acknowledgement that she was there, and turned back to the flames. It took her a long moment, but she finally lowered her shoulders, breathing out through her cracked lips in a long, shuddering sigh. She sat up slowly, the blanket clutched to her chest. He stood and stepped to the water barrel, filling a tin cup, then crossed the cabin and offered it to her. She took it with both hands, sipped, winced at the cold, then drank the rest in a single desperate draught. Jedediah went back to the stove and began slicing salt pork. She watched him now, more awake, her eyes clearer than the night before, but her expression stayed guarded, a fortress against a world she had every reason to fear. He set a pan over the flame and added the meat. The sizzling smell filled the small room, a fragrance of survival and warmth. He cracked 2 eggs into the pan, then 2 more. She hadn't asked for food, but she didn't look away from the pan either. Her gaze was fixed on the promise of sustenance. Jedediah placed 2 plates on the table. "Sunday," he said, his voice a low rumble. Slow. He had broken his own rule of silence, and the sound felt strange in the small cabin. Clara hesitated, then rose. The blanket slipped, revealing the deep tear across her dress's neckline again. Jedediah didn't react. He looked down at his plate. Clara noticed. He saw the subtle movement of her chin as she pulled the blanket back up, a gesture of self-protection. She sat across from him. They ate in silence, but this time the silence wasn't thick with fear. It was just quiet. Halfway through the meal, her voice came soft and tentative. "Your place," she said. "It's far from town." Jedediah nodded once. 12-mile West Road. She chewed slowly, thoughtfully, then swallowed. "You live alone?" "Yeah." Another pause. A long 5-year pause. She nodded. "Good." She looked away as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders, and then that was all she said for a while. Jedediah stood when the meal was finished and started washing the plates. She rose and helped him, taking a rag and wiping the tin plates dry. They didn't speak. She just did. After she turned toward the hearth and folded the blanket, placing it neatly on the chair. "Where do you want me?" she asked, not like someone looking for directions. More like someone who expected to be told where to scrub. Jedediah looked at her. The dark bruises along her arms were more visible in the morning light. The way she stood stiffly, her hands clasped in front of her thighs as if waiting for a command. He scratched his beard, a habit he'd developed when thinking. "You need rest," he said, his voice even. "You're not here to work." Her jaw tightened slightly. "I wasn't trying to be a burden." "You're not." She blinked at that. It didn't seem to register. It was a kindness she was not accustomed to. Then she stepped past him and began sweeping the floor anyway. Not frantically, but with a deliberate, focused energy. Jedediah let her. He understood. It was a way for her to feel useful. A way to anchor herself in a world that had tried to unmoor her completely. Outside, the wind held low, a low moan. Snow flurries had started. He opened the door and stared out at the sky. No sun, just clouds like lead and an edge of white covering the bare edges of his barn. He turned back inside. Clara had taken a rag to the counter now. She wiped in slow, methodical circles. Her expression had gone blank, but her movements were precise. Jedediah watched her for a moment, a knot of worry in his gut. "Where do you come from?" he asked, not demanding. His voice was calm, a soft rumble of curiosity that held no threat. She stopped wiping, then set the cloth down with a quiet finality. "South," she said. "Around Prescott. Had people there. My stepbrothers." She paused, a long, difficult pause. "They sold me." Jedediah didn't ask why. He didn't need to. The answer was already written in the bruises on her arms and the rip across her dress. He simply listened. Clara sat down on the edge of the chair, her hands folded in her lap. "A man took me for a mule and a saddle. Said I could cook. Said I was quiet." Her voice dropped lower, a bitter, self-aware sound. "Didn't stay quiet enough, I guess." Jedediah's jaw set. He didn't move, a silent observer to her pain. Clara looked up, her gaze direct for the first time. "I didn't kill him, if that's what you're wondering." He shook his head once, a slow, deliberate movement. "I wasn't." That made her pause again. Something shifted in her face, a subtle release of tension, like a weight dropping from the back of her neck. Not trust, not yet, but something just past survival. Jedediah reached for his coat. "I got livestock to check," he said, his voice flat. "Storm's coming in hard." She stood. "I'll come." He studied her. The delicate shape of her, the frayed and torn fabric of her dress. "You can't work in that dress," he said plainly. She looked down at herself, her legs exposed, her chest half showing through the torn bodice. She straightened her shoulders, a spark of defiance in her eyes. "Then show me where the needle is." Jedediah hesitated, then turned to the small wooden box near the shelf. He opened it and handed her a tin of needles and thread wrapped in muslin. "You can sew." Clara gave a faint nod. Learned young. Was expected. Jedediah stepped out into the wind. As he closed the door behind him, he glanced back once. She was seated again, already threading the needle, her head bowed and her hands steady despite the bruises. Out in the yard, snow was beginning to stick to the ground. The storm was coming in heavy. Jedediah pulled his collar up, adjusted his hat, and started toward the barn. She hadn't asked to stay. She'd just come in. But he was beginning to think, maybe, just maybe, he didn't mind. By mid-morning, the storm was fully over the foothills. Snow came fast and heavy, covering the ground in a thick insulating coat that muffled everything: the sound of his boots on the packed earth, the sound of his breath, the distant howl of the wind between the trees. Boone worked in silence, pulling hay into the troughs, brushing snow off the backs of the 2 remaining mules, and checking the latches on the barn doors twice over. The animals didn't seem bothered. They'd been through worse. As he finished tying down the final hinge against the wind, his thoughts drifted back to the cabin. To her. He hadn't meant to let her in, not at first. But there had been something about the way she didn't ask, just offered. The way she'd stood there, shaking and silent, with the kind of eyes that didn't expect kindness anymore. That kind of woman either died on the trail or became someone else entirely. And something about her, a tenacious spirit he couldn't quite name, told him that she hadn't died yet. Jedediah stepped back into the cabin around noon, stomping snow from his boots with a loud rhythmic thud. The warmth inside hit his face first. The fire was going strong again, and the smell of food, actual food, not just heated beans, reached him before he even took off his coat. Clara was at the stove, her sleeves rolled up over her forearms, her skirt stitched with a coarse patch across the thigh. The neckline of her dress was still low, still frayed, but she'd sewn it tighter at the chest, enough to hold. Still, the shape of her body, soft, curvy, full, was visible beneath the fabric. She didn't hide it, but she didn't flaunt it either. She moved with intention, not performance. Jedediah watched her for a moment before stepping fully inside. She turned, holding a pan in her hand. "I found some cornmeal," she said, her voice still quiet but steadier now. "Hope you don't mind." He shook his head, a gesture of silent permission. "I boiled beans too," she continued. "Salted 'em. Didn't know if you liked it heavy." He took a seat at the table. "Don't matter." She brought the plate over and sat across from him. There was cornbread, beans, and even a bit of molasses from a jar he hadn't opened in over a year. She'd found it on her own. "You always keep this place this clean?" she asked between bites. "I clean enough to keep mice away," he said. "Not like this." She gave a tight nod. "It helps me. Doing things." Jedediah didn't respond, but he understood. Some folks drank, some went numb, some just stayed busy so the quiet didn't swallow them up whole. They ate in silence. This time it felt easier. The air wasn't so tense. When they finished, Clara gathered the plates again and went about rinsing them, a quiet rhythm already established between them. Jedediah stood and checked the stove. "You warm enough?" "I'm fine." He looked at her face, flushed now from the heat of the fire but less pale than the day before. Her lips were no longer cracked. The bruises on her arms looked darker today, a deeper blue against her pale skin, as the blood rose near the surface, but she moved with less stiffness. "You rest at all?" he asked. "A little," she said, drying a plate with a slow, careful motion. "Slept with my eyes open, I think." She paused, the cloth still in her hand. "I don't sleep real deep anymore." Jedediah gave a short nod. He understood that. She sat back down slowly, smoothing the skirt over her thighs, an unconscious gesture. "You were in the war?" she asked, watching his limp as he moved back toward the hearth. He didn't answer right away. "Yeah," he said. "Which side?" "Union." She didn't flinch at the answer. She just processed the information, adding it to the quiet book she was writing about him in her mind. "You lose someone?" she asked softly. Jedediah sat in the chair by the fire, his gaze fixed on the dancing flames. "Brother," he said, his voice flat. She waited a moment before speaking, giving him the space to hold that pain. "I lost my mother young. My father too. Stepbrothers after that. They made things worse." Jedediah looked into the fire. "You running from them?" She nodded. "I told them I wouldn't lay with a man for trade, that I'd cook clean work." She paused, the memory a physical thing in the room between them. They didn't care. She didn't cry when she said it. Her voice was steady, even flat, the well of her tears long since dried up. Jedediah rubbed his hands together. "You got somewhere you plan on going?" "No," she said plainly. "Not anymore." She looked at him carefully, her eyes meeting his. "I'm not asking to stay forever. Just not to be pushed out. Not yet." Jedediah didn't speak for a long time. The fire popped between them, a small, loud explosion in the quiet. Then he stood cross to the corner and brought back a heavy buffalo hide blanket. He handed it to her without a word. She didn't thank him. She just took it, unfolding it across her lap, its weight a promise of warmth and protection. That afternoon they worked together. Clara scrubbed out the hearth, found the old iron kettle, and soaked it until the rust loosened. Jedediah brought in more wood and repaired the hinge on the back door. She stitched the lining of his coat without asking. He noticed but didn't mention it. At one point, as the sun began to fade behind thick snow clouds, Jedediah caught her staring out the window. Her hand was braced on the sill, her face unreadable. He came up beside her. "Something out there." She shook her head. "I was just thinking, if they come looking for me, you won't hand me back, will you?" He didn't answer right away. He looked out too, over the white field, the silent barn, the distant ridge. "No one comes this far," he said. And then, with a quiet finality that was as solid as the mountains themselves, he added, "And if they do, they'll answer to me." She didn't smile, but her shoulders eased just slightly. That night she laid near the fire again. But this time she was the one who pulled the blanket up tight, rested her head down, and closed her eyes without flinching. Boone watched her from the bed. She was still broken, still weary, but she was sleeping. And for now that was enough. The next morning the sun didn't show. Only a pale, colorless light filtered through the frost-caked windows. Snow had buried the path to the barn and piled against the door so high Jedediah had to shoulder it open. The air outside burned the lungs. Inside the cabin it was quiet but not tense. Something had shifted. Jedediah stepped back and shaking snow off his coat. Clara was at the stove, bare feet against the plank floor, sleeves pushed up, stirring a pot. Her dress, still worn and patched, had been stitched again across the skirt. The neckline was still low, and the curve of her full chest was visible beneath it. But now it was sewn neater, held better. She moved with less stiffness. Jedediah watched her work. She'd found bacon ends in the bottom of a tin and was frying them with cornmeal. She looked up when she heard the door close but didn't speak. Just gave a nod and kept stirring. He removed his coat, hung it near the fire, and sat. She brought 2 plates and set them down. Steam rose off the food, a fragrant steam that promised warmth and comfort. Jedediah took a bite, chewed slow. "You ever work on a ranch?" he asked. Clara sat across from him. "Number just kitchens. Some back rooms. I always knew how to keep a place going, even when it wasn't mine." Jedediah said nothing, but the way he looked at her, steady, unflinching, made her keep talking. "They never taught me to ride. I wasn't meant to go far." She didn't look down when she said it. The meaning was clear. She'd been kept, used. Not as a wife, not even as a worker, just as something owned. "You're not kept here," he said. "I know." She said it quick, like she needed to make sure he heard her before anything changed. They finished the meal in silence. Then, without being asked, Clara began cleaning. She moved slowly today, her body still bruised, still healing, but her pace was steady. She washed, dried, swept, and straightened with practiced hands. Jedediah gathered his tools. The barn roof had started to sag under the weight of the snow. He needed to reinforce it. Before stepping out, he turned to her. "If you come outside, wear my coat." Clara glanced at it. "It's too big. It's warm." He handed it over. She slipped it on. It swallowed her, the sleeves falling past her hands, but she didn't argue. Outside, the snow had softened. The wind had died some, and the world looked blank and clean. They walked to the barn side by side. Jedediah started shoring up the beams. Clara stood off to the side, watching for a while. Then she fetched wood without asking, held the ladder steady while he climbed and passed nails and brace planks to him. They didn't speak, but something wordless passed between them. A current of usefulness, of trust. She didn't flinch when he climbed down near her. Didn't tense when he passed close. By late afternoon, the roof held again. Back inside, Clara moved slower. Her shoulders were tight. Jedediah brought over a basin of warm water and a cloth. "You're sore." She nodded once. He didn't reach for her, just set the basin beside her and stepped back. But she surprised him. "Will you?" she asked, her eyes on the fire. "Just my shoulders. I can't reach." Jedediah didn't answer right away. He moved to her, slowly sat behind her. She let the coat slide off her shoulders. Her dress sagged low across her back, the neckline loose. Her skin was marked deep red around the shoulder blades, blue, bruising down one side. He dipped the cloth in the water and wrung it out with careful hands. When he pressed the warm rag against her skin, she exhaled like she hadn't realized she'd been holding her breath. He cleaned in slow circular motions. Not hard, not soft, just enough. She didn't flinch. When he finished, he set the cloth down and pulled the coat back up over her shoulders. She turned. Her face was close to his now. Hazel green eyes open and clear. No makeup, No pretense. There was a silence between them, not of nervousness, but of a profound held breath. Her hand came up and rested gently on his. It was the first time she'd touched him. Jedediah didn't move. Her fingers stayed for a moment, then slid away. She stood and walked to the hearth. He sat back in the chair, staring into the fire. He could still feel where her hand had been. That night she slept near the fire again, but turned to face him this time. Before closing her eyes, she whispered, "Thank you." Jedediah didn't answer out loud, but he didn't sleep for a long while. He listened to the wind die outside. He thought about her bruises. The scar across her collarbone he'd noticed but not touched. The fact that she'd let him help, and the way her hand had rested on his like it meant something. He hadn't asked her to stay, but she hadn't asked to leave either. The next few days passed without words needing to be said. Snow kept falling softer now, blanketing the hills and pressing a profound silence into every inch of Jedediah Stone's land. The cold held, but the storm had passed. Inside the cabin, something quieter had begun to shift, not in the weather, but between them. Clara had found a rhythm. She rose before Jedediah most mornings, bundled in his coat. Her hair still tangled, but her steps sure. She boiled water, lit the fire, and kept the cabin warm. She didn't ask permission. She didn't wait to be told what to do. She simply moved through the space like she'd been part of it longer than a week. Jedediah didn't mind. He found himself listening for her movements in the early dark, her soft feet on the planks, the clatter of tin mugs, the sound of a spoon scraping against the bottom of a pot. He hadn't realized how much a sound like that could mean to him until it came from her. That morning, Clara had pulled her mended dress tighter with a strip of torn cloth she'd sewn into a sash. Her bust still pushed visibly against the neckline, but now it looked more like something she'd chosen, not something that had been taken. Jedediah caught glimpses, not with a hungry lust, not yet, but with a slow, profound awareness. He noticed the way her hips moved as she swept, how the torn slit up her skirt caught her thigh when she crouched near the fire. He didn't stare, but he noticed. And he felt a flicker of guilt, a ghost of his old self that he hadn't thought about in years. She never caught him looking. Or maybe she did, but didn't say anything. They spent that morning mending the fence line behind the barn. The wind had knocked out 3 posts during the storm. Jedediah showed her how to hold the stake while he drove it in, and she didn't flinch when the hammer swung down close. She stood steady, her eyes on the post, her hands red from the cold but determined. "You done this before?" he asked, adjusting his grip. She looked at him. "Never, but it's not hard if someone shows you." He nodded once. "You're learning quick." Clara didn't smile, but her eyes softened. Later, while they ate by the fire, boiled potatoes and venison from a salted slab Jedediah had stored in the cellar, Clara sat closer than she had before. Her knee brushed his once lightly. She didn't move it away. After the meal, she cleaned. Jedediah stepped outside to stack wood. When he returned, she was brushing her hair by the hearth, long and dark, falling in waves down her back. The neckline of her dress had slipped again, baring the top of one full breast. Accidental or not, he didn't know, but she didn't cover it right away. He turned, giving her privacy a quiet respect that was more powerful than any words he could have spoken. She didn't thank him, but she didn't pull away from him later either, when he sat beside her with 2 mugs of warm water and they stared into the fire together. The silence between them wasn't awkward anymore. It felt like breathing. It felt like a song. After a while, she set her mug down and shifted to face him. "I used to believe no man could touch me without wanting to own me," she said quietly, the words a confession. "But you haven't." Jedediah didn't look at her directly. His voice came low, a deep rumble from his chest. "That's not why I let you in." "I know." She paused, her gaze steady. "That's why I'm still here." She reached over and placed her hand on his again like she had days before. But this time she didn't pull away. Jedediah turned his hand over beneath hers. Let their fingers rest, barely touching. Clara moved closer. She didn't say anything else, just leaned against him, her head resting near his shoulder, her breath warm through the worn linen of his shirt. He didn't move. He let her stay there. Minutes passed. Then she lifted her face slowly, her eyes on his, a world of longing and uncertainty in their depths. Jedediah looked down at her, and for once he didn't pull away. Clara's lips were cracked but soft. When she leaned in, it wasn't hesitant. He met her halfway. The kiss was quiet, slow, a gentle inquiry between two lonely people. There was no hunger in it, just truth. The warmth of her body against his, the way her fingers curled into his shirt, the way his hands settled on the side of her waist, careful not to press too hard. When they pulled apart, neither of them spoke. She didn't ask what it meant. He didn't offer to explain. She just rested her head against him again, and he let her stay like that until the fire burned low. That night she didn't sleep by the hearth. She stood beside the bed instead after he'd already laid down. "I'm not here to buy comfort," she said softly, her voice a ghost in the dark. "But I don't want to sleep alone." Jedediah didn't answer. He moved over. Clara climbed in beside him. The mattress creaked beneath their combined weight. She curled into him, her back against his chest, and he draped the blanket over them both. He didn't touch her beyond that. She didn't ask him to, but he felt her breath steady, felt her hand find his beneath the blanket, and that was enough. They didn't speak vows. They didn't call it anything, but something had changed, not forced, not bargained. It was chosen. The cabin was warm when Jedediah woke, warmer than it had been in months. The fire still glowed in the hearth, a faint orange light flickering across the log walls. Snow tapped at the windows in a quiet rhythm, but the wind had eased. For once the world outside felt distant, a faraway country that no longer held any power over him. Clara lay curled against him beneath the blanket. Her back was pressed to his chest, her breathing deep and even. Her long hair trailed across the pillow and over his arm. And when she shifted slightly in her sleep, Jedediah tightened his arm around her waist without thinking. She didn't pull away. She didn't flinch. He lay still, unsure how long he stayed like that. Years, it felt like. He watched the way the fire danced shadows across the shape of her body, her curves, the gentle rise of her hip beneath the blanket, the smooth skin of her shoulder where the dress had slipped down again in the night. But it wasn't lust in him. It was a slow ache, an understanding. She had chosen to stay. When she stirred awake, her hand found his beneath the blanket, her fingers curling into his. She didn't look up right away, just rested there a moment longer. "I didn't think I'd sleep," she whispered finally. "You did," Jedediah said, his voice low, still rough from morning. "I didn't wake once." He didn't say it, but he had. Not from discomfort. He'd spent most of the night listening to her breathe, reminding himself she was real, a tangible presence in his lonely world. They rose together slowly. Jedediah lit the stove while she drew water. She'd found one of his old shirts days ago, a brown flannel worn soft by time, and now she slipped it on over her patched dress. It was far too big, but it covered her better. She still moved carefully, still flinched slightly when her shoulder pulled wrong, but her bruises were fading. While breakfast cooked, Jedediah sat by the window sharpening his knife. Clara sliced bread and stirred oats in a tin pot, humming under her breath, barely audible, but it was the first sound like that Jedediah had heard from her. Not words. Just a sound that wasn't survival. "Jedediah," she asked after a while, still facing the stove. "Yeah, if I wanted to stay. Not just for the storm, would that be all right?" He looked up. "I already figured you had." She turned to him. "I needed to hear it." He nodded once. "You're not in my way." That was as close to an invitation as Jedediah could give. She smiled faintly and turned back to the pot. They ate together. She didn't sit across from him anymore. She sat beside him, their shoulders brushing. And when he stood to wash the bowls, she came with him, drying them with a rag without being asked. Later that day, Jedediah hauled the woodpile closer to the door. The drifts had iced up overnight, and it took longer than usual. Clara came outside in his coat, holding the bucket, her hair tied back, now her cheeks red from the cold. They worked side by side, passing kindling, checking the animal shed. The roof still held. The mules began stomping at their stalls, restless from being penned up so long. Jedediah fed them by hand. Clara watched from the doorway, her arms folded, snow clinging to her moccasins. When they stepped back into the cabin, both dusted in white, Clara shut the door behind them and turned to face him. "I never thought I'd feel safe again," she said. Her voice was soft but steady. "Not like this." Jedediah removed his coat and hung it on the hook. "You are," he said plainly. She walked toward him, her hand sliding along his shirt, resting at his chest. She looked up, her hazel green eyes wide but not afraid. "I want you," she said, "but not because I owe you." "You don't," he answered. "I know." She kissed him, then slow with intent. Jedediah kissed her back, his hands bracing her waist. He didn't rush, didn't take more than she gave. Her body pressed to his, and he felt her warmth through the fabric, the curves of her hips against him, her chest rising against his. When she pulled his shirt from his waistband, he let her. They moved together toward the bed, clothes loosened but not torn, nothing forced. The blanket fell over them, hiding nothing but softening everything. It was slow. Her hand guided his. His lips brushed her shoulder, her throat, her chest. And when he entered her, it was silent. No gasps, no cries, just closeness. Her arms wrapped around his neck and his head rested against hers. He moved carefully, reading every twitch of her fingers, every shift in her breath. After they lay tangled together, her leg across his arm under her back, She didn't speak. Neither did he. They didn't need to. It wasn't about what had just happened. It was about the fact she hadn't left, that she'd come to his bed by her own steps, that she'd stayed. When Clara finally drifted off, Jedediah didn't follow her into sleep. He watched the snowfall return through the window crack, then looked down at the woman curled against him. He still didn't know everything she'd been through. She didn't know what he'd lost either. But that didn't matter now. They were here. And for the first time in years, Jedediah didn't feel alone. Jedediah woke before dawn like he always did. The fire had burned low again, leaving only coals that pulsed gently in the dark. The air inside the cabin was cold but not bitter. His arm was asleep under the weight of Clara's body. She was curled tightly against him, her breath soft, her hand resting over his ribs. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. Her warmth beside him was real. He still found himself checking, not out of doubt but out of disbelief. He hadn't planned on any of this. He didn't even know what this was yet, but he didn't want it to stop. Clara stirred slightly, then blinked her eyes open. She looked up at him, groggy, her hair falling over her cheek. "Is it morning?" "Almost." She didn't move, just closed her eyes again and breathed. By the time the light came through the window, Jedediah had already lit the stove. Clara sat up slowly, pulling the blanket to her chest, then stood and pulled on his oversized flannel shirt again. Her dress was folded neatly at the foot of the bed. They moved around the cabin like they'd been doing it for years. Quiet, measured, without fuss. She fixed the morning pot of oats while he checked the door, cracked it open, and measured the snowpack. The storm was breaking. The sky beyond was clear for the first time in days, blue and sharp, clean across the ridgeline. As they ate, Clara seemed quieter than usual. Not withdrawn, just thoughtful. "You all right?" Jedediah asked. She nodded slowly, spoon in hand. "Just thinking." He didn't push. He didn't need to. After the meal, she helped him stack the last of the dry wood and brush snow off the roof edge. Her hands were red from the cold, but she didn't complain. When they returned inside, she moved to the fire, rubbing warmth back into her fingers. She turned then. "Jedediah, can I ask you something?" He looked over from the window. "Yeah, why haven't you gone back east?" He paused. It wasn't a question he'd expected. "My brother died there. My wife died here. Going back didn't make sense." Clara studied him a moment. "You loved her?" He nodded once. "Yeah." She didn't ask anything more about Eleanor, didn't press about how she died or what it had done to him. Jedediah respected that. After a long pause, Clara sat beside him on the bench, folding her legs under her. She looked down at her lap. "I was thinking, if I stay, I mean really stay, I don't want to be a ghost in your house. I want to be useful, part of it. You already are." "I mean," she said, looking up at him, her eyes searching his, more than cooking, more than cleaning. Jedediah looked at her. "Like what?" She hesitated then. A slow determination filled her face. "If we fix up the other stall in the barn, we could raise chickens again. Maybe plant something come spring. I can sell things if you go into town. We could build something." Jedediah didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on hers, watching her speak a quiet plea in her words, as if she was waiting for him to take it all away. "I got no one else," she said quietly. "And I'm not trying to steal from what you had before. I just want something real. Something mine." Jedediah rested his hand over hers, his calloused palm covering her small, strong hand. "You're not a guest," he said, his voice a low, steady rumble. "You're not passing through. Not unless you say so." She turned her hand under his and held it tight. "I don't want to pass through." That afternoon, she unpacked the small cloth bundle she'd hidden beneath the bed. What little she'd carried when she first knocked on his door, a comb, a cracked mirror, a thimble, and a letter with no seal. She didn't let him read it, just folded it again and tucked it deep into the drawer with her underthings. Jedediah repaired the cellar door. She mended one of his work shirts. He watched her stitch, the way her fingers moved. Calm, capable. That night, after they finished supper and sat watching the fire, Jedediah spoke. "I was thinking about the fence line. South edge. I'll need help digging again once the snow melts." She looked over, surprised. "You want me to help with that? You said you wanted to build something." Her smile was small, a quiet, perfect thing that reached her eyes. Before they went to bed, Clara stood near the fire in nothing but Jedediah's shirt. She turned toward him slowly. "I want you to touch me again," she said, "but only if you want to. Not because I owe it." He rose, stepped to her. "I don't take what's not offered." "I know," she whispered. This time she reached for him first. The days began to stretch longer. The sky held light past supper now, and when Jedediah stepped outside one morning, the snow had thinned enough to see brown earth beneath the drifts. Birds had returned, not many but enough to remind him the season was turning. Inside, Clara had changed too. She moved through the cabin with ease, no longer careful in that haunted way. She laughed, sometimes low and short, usually at something Jedediah hadn't meant to be funny. She stood straighter. When she caught his eyes, she didn't look away. Jedediah had started clearing the south edge of the property just like he'd said. The fence needed more than mending. It needed rebuilding. Clara joined him most mornings after breakfast, wrapped in her shawl and boots that barely held together. He offered a ride to town for new ones. She nodded but said, "Not yet. I want to earn them." He didn't argue. One afternoon, after hammering the last rail into place, Jedediah leaned on the post and looked at her. "You don't have to prove anything." "I'm not," she said. "I just like knowing this is mine too." He nodded once. That was enough. Back in the cabin that evening, as she stirred a pot of stew, Clara moved slower than usual. Jedediah noticed the way she paused between steps as if she was catching her breath. When she sat down to eat, she barely touched her bowl. He looked at her closely. Her cheeks were flushed, not from the fire. Her eyes were glassy. "You sick?" She shook her head, pressing her palm to her belly. Just for a second. Then she shook her head again, a slow dawning realization on her face. "I don't think so." He didn't push. Later that night, she leaned against the doorway, watching him shave the edge of a new board for the barn. Her arms were folded over her chest, her face unreadable. "I'm late," she said. Jedediah stopped his work, looked up at her. "For what?" She held his eyes, a world of meaning in her gaze. The kind of late that doesn't fix itself. Jedediah stayed still, the wood in his hands forgotten. Then he stood slowly, setting the tool down. "You sure?" "Number not yet. But it feels like it." He walked to her. Clara didn't move. She tilted her head, slightly waiting. "I don't expect anything from you," she said, quieter now. "If that's what you're thinking, I don't want you to feel trapped." Jedediah stepped closer. He took her hands in his. "You think I'd walk away from this? I've seen men do it. I'm not them." She looked up at him for a long moment and then nodded. "I know." He rested a hand over hers. "Whatever it is," he said, "we handle it." That night she sat in his lap by the fire, curled against him in a way she hadn't before. Like she wasn't bracing for bad news. Like she wasn't waiting for things to fall apart. She kissed him slow, long, and held the back of his neck when he returned it. They made love again, not in desperation, but with purpose. Her dress slipped down her shoulders, the shirt beneath falling open. She guided him with her hands, slow and steady. He moved carefully, holding her hips, his chest against hers. When he touched her stomach, she covered his hand with her own. Later, they lay together, her head on his chest, listening to the wind settle outside. "You ever think you'd have this again?" she asked. Jedediah shook his head. "Didn't think I deserved it." "You do," she said it like a fact. A truth as solid as stone. "You be all right with a child here?" she asked after a while. He looked down at her, his voice a low, gravelly sound. "You think I'd let you do it alone?" She closed her eyes. Number not anymore. That was the moment it became real. Not just the baby, but the life forming around it. Spring came late that year, but it came sure. The snow melted in slow layers, leaving behind wet earth and a yard full of thawing fence posts. Birds nested in the rafters of the barn, and runoff from the ridge fed the dry creek that hadn't moved in nearly a year. Jedediah built a coop behind the shed with reclaimed wood. Clara planted potatoes in the softest patch of dirt near the cabin's south wall. The world had thawed, and so had they. Clara's belly grew round by the week. She didn't try to hide it. She wore Jedediah's shirts open over her dress, the fabric stretched tight across her middle. Her walk had changed a little slower, a hand at her lower back sometimes, but she never asked for rest. Jedediah offered it anyway. She took it when she needed to. She'd been living with him for nearly 5 months now, and neither of them had ever spoken of marriage. One warm morning, Jedediah woke to find her already gone from bed. He rose, pulled on his trousers and boots, and followed the smell of smoke to the barn. She was there, sweeping the stall where they planned to keep a goat later in the season. She paused when she saw him. He leaned against the door frame. "You're not supposed to be lifting." "I'm not. I'm pushing." He shook his head. She smiled. Jedediah stepped inside, his hands in his pockets. For a moment, he just stood there watching her. Her hair was loose, her body fuller now. Hips wide, chest heavier, her dress low. As always, the neckline still open and soft over her curves. She looked stronger now than the day he found her. Not just in body. Something else. "I started carving something," he said. "Oh?" she asked, leaning the broom against the wall. He walked over to the far corner of the barn, pulled back a canvas cloth. There, under the light filtering in through the rafters, was a cradle. Simple, solid, sanded smooth. The shape was rough but sure. Clara stood there staring at it, her lips parted. "You made this," Jedediah noted. "You didn't even ask me. You didn't need to." She stepped closer, ran her hand over the edge of the cradle. Then she turned her eyes glassy, but she wasn't crying. "You've never asked me to be yours," she said. "You've never said it." Jedediah looked at her a long time. "I figured you'd already chosen," he said. "Didn't think words would change it." She stepped in front of him, her hands rested on his chest, her head tilted just slightly. "I did choose you. I still am." "Then stay," he said, his voice a low, powerful whisper. "Stay. As mine." She nodded once. "I already have." There was no ring, no church, no papers. But Jedediah pressed his forehead to hers, his hands on her stomach, and she whispered husband against his chest. He didn't correct her. That night they shared the bed like always, but it felt different. Jedediah lay beside her, one hand on her stomach, the other tracing the curve of her arm. "I want her to have your eyes," Clara murmured. Her Jedediah asked. Clara nodded. "I feel it. A girl. Strong. Quiet like you. Stubborn like me." He chuckled under his breath, then kissed her collarbone, letting his lips rest there. "When she's old enough," he said, "I'll show her how to build. You teach her how to stay." Clara looked up. "You think that's what we've done?" "Stayed." Jedediah nodded. That's all it ever was. And it was true. No promises had been spoken, no debts owed. They had built their home from silence, routine, and a choice. She had come to his door, half frozen and whispering. He had opened it, and neither had left since. In the final days of spring, as birds gathered string for nests, and the land turned green in places it hadn't before, Jedediah placed the cradle in the corner of the cabin. He didn't say a word. Clara saw it when she came in from hanging laundry. She stood there a long while, just staring at it. Then she walked over, sat on the edge of the bed, and rested her hand over her belly. Jedediah came behind her, kissed the top of her head, and wrapped his arms around her. No vows, no preacher, no applause. Just two people quiet, holding on. And this time the door never closed again. The story of Jedediah and Clara reminds us that quiet kindness and compassion can mend even the most broken souls. In a world that often feels loud and cold, the most precious gifts aren't grand words, but a door left open, a gaze free of judgment, or a hand offered without demand. Growing older doesn't mean the end. It's a time to realize that the smallest acts, a warm meal, a silent embrace, can become the beginning of something new. Sometimes all it takes to start again is being seen, being safe, and being allowed to stay. Enjoying these epic Wild West stories? Hit subscribe for more gripping tales of bravery, conflict, and unexpected heroes. Now tap the video on screen to experience a story with a twist you'll never forget.